In the late 19th century, West Africa was a place of great change and tension. Powerful local kingdoms and ambitious European powers were increasingly coming into contact, and their goals often clashed. In what is now southwestern Nigeria, the Ijebu Kingdom was a strong and proud nation. The Ijebu people were famous for their skills in business and trade. They controlled the most important roads that connected the busy port of Lagos, which was under British control, to the rich Yoruba hinterlands, especially the great city of Ibadan. This control was the source of their wealth and influence, allowing them to decide who could trade and what prices should be paid for goods passing through their lands. This powerful position, however, created a serious problem. The British in Lagos wanted trade to be completely free. They dreamed of building railways and opening up the entire region to their merchants, without having to pay taxes or ask for permission from local rulers like the Ijebu. Similarly, the people of Ibadan, who produced many goods, felt trapped. The Ijebu acted as middlemen, controlling the flow of products like palm oil, cocoa, and textiles to the coast. In 1891, the ruler of Ijebu, the Awujale, decided to enforce this control strictly. He set up a blockade at the bustling Ejirin market, stopping all trade and demanding fees, which angered both the British and the people of Ibadan. The Ijebu Kingdom had a long history of independence and had managed its affairs for centuries. Their control over the trade routes was not just about money, it was a way of protecting their sovereignty and their way of life. They saw the increasing British presence in Lagos as a threat to their independence and their economic prosperity. By closing the roads, they were sending a clear message. This was their land and they would make the rules. The British, on the other hand, saw this as an obstacle to their grand colonial ambitions. They believed in something they called free trade, which really meant trade that benefited them the most, without interference from African leaders. This clash of interests created a tense standoff. For the British merchants in Lagos, the blockade was a disaster, as their supply of goods from the interior dried up. For the Ibadan traders, it was deeply frustrating, as they could not sell their produce at the coast. The Ijebu, meanwhile, stood firm, believing they had every right to control commerce within their own territory. This economic dispute was more than just an argument over money. It was a fundamental conflict between a proud, independent African kingdom and an expanding European empire. The blockade became a wall, not just of commerce, but of ideals, setting the stage for a conflict that would change the region forever. Before the fighting began, there were attempts to find a peaceful solution. The British officials in Lagos, led by acting Governor C.M. Denton, knew that a war would be costly and difficult. They first tried to use diplomacy to convince the Ijebu to open the trade routes. They sent messages and representatives to the court of the Awujale, the king of the Ijebu people. Their main argument was that the blockade was hurting everyone and that trade should be allowed to flow freely for the benefit of all. They tried to persuade the Ijebu leaders that their future prosperity depended on cooperating with the British and the other Yoruba states like Ibadan. The Awujale and his council of chiefs listened to the British proposals, but were not easily convinced. They had seen how European powers operated in other parts of Africa and were suspicious of their true intentions. They feared that opening the roads completely would be the first step towards losing their independence. From their perspective, the British were not asking for free trade, but for total control. In January 1892, a fragile agreement was reached. The Ijebu leaders agreed to accept a payment of £500 each year from the British government as compensation for keeping the trade routes open. It seemed for a brief moment that a crisis had been avoided. However, this agreement was built on a foundation of mistrust and did not last long. The deep-seated suspicions on both sides remained. A short time after the deal was made, a white Christian missionary tried to pass through Ijebuland. He was refused entry. For the Ijebu, allowing a European missionary to travel freely through their land was a security risk and a challenge to their authority. They believed that missionaries were often the forerunners of colonial armies, mapping out the land and weakening traditional beliefs before a military takeover. This single incident was all the British needed to claim that the agreement had been broken. The refusal to allow the missionary passage was seen by the British as a deliberate act of defiance. Governor Gilbert Thomas Carter of Lagos declared that the Ijebu had gone back on their word and could not be trusted. He argued that diplomacy had failed and that the only remaining option was to use force. The British presented the situation as a matter of honor and treaty obligations, but it was also a convenient excuse to achieve their long-term goal, breaking the Ijebu's power once and for all. The time for talking was over. The failure of these diplomatic efforts meant that the clash between the Ijebu and the British would now be settled on the battlefield. With diplomatic talks officially declared a failure, the British colonial administration in Lagos began to prepare for war. Governor Carter was determined to crush the Ijebu and permanently open the trade routes. He gave the order to assemble a military force strong enough to invade and defeat one of the most respected kingdoms in Yoruba land. The mission was officially framed as a punitive expedition, meant to punish the Ijebu for breaking their treaty and to enforce free trade. In reality, it was a carefully planned military campaign designed to expand British power and influence deep into the heart of the region. The task of leading this invasion was given to Colonel Francis C. Scott, an experienced British officer who was the Inspector General of the Gold Coast Constabulary. He was a seasoned commander who understood the logistics of colonial warfare in West Africa. His orders were clear: march into Ijebuland, defeat the Ijebu Army, capture the capital city of Ijebu-Ode, and remove the trade blockade for good. Colonel Scott began to gather his forces, drawing on soldiers and resources from various British colonies along the West African coast. This was not going to be a small skirmish. It was a major military operation. The force assembled under Colonel Scott's command was a diverse mix, reflecting the nature of the British Empire. It included a core of professional British officers and non-commissioned officers who provided leadership and technical expertise. Alongside them were soldiers from other parts of Africa who served in the British colonial armies. A significant number of troops were Hausa soldiers, recruited from what is now northern Nigeria, who were known for their discipline and fighting skills. In addition to the soldiers, a large number of carriers, or porters, were recruited from Lagos, the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, and Sierra Leone to carry supplies, ammunition, and equipment through the dense forests and swamps. This preparation sent a clear and intimidating message across the region. The British were not just sending a warning, they were mobilizing for a full-scale invasion. The gathering of soldiers, the stockpiling of modern weapons, and the arrival of military ships in the Lagos Lagoon signaled that a major conflict was imminent. For the Ijebu, the news of this military buildup was alarming. They knew they would have to defend their homeland against a well-equipped and determined enemy. The drums of war were now beating loudly, and the stage was set for a historic confrontation between an ancient African kingdom and a modern industrial empire. In May 1892, the British invasion of Ijebuland began. The Expeditionary Force, under the command of Colonel F.C. Scott, was a formidable and diverse group, meticulously assembled for the campaign. The total fighting force numbered around 450 soldiers. This may not sound like a large army, but it was a highly professional and well-armed unit for its time. The leadership was composed of experienced British officers who had served in various colonial campaigns across the empire. They brought with them strategic knowledge and a rigid military discipline that they imposed upon the entire force, ensuring that every part of the unit worked together like a well-oiled machine. The bulk of the fighting men were not British, but African soldiers serving the British crown. About 150 of these soldiers were Hausas, recruited from the north. The Hausa Constabulary were renowned for their bravery and loyalty, and they formed the backbone of many British colonial forces in West Africa. In addition to the Hausas, the force included troops from the Lagos Constabulary and soldiers brought in from the Gold Coast. These African soldiers were trained in European military tactics and were armed with modern breech-loading rifles, which gave them a significant advantage over armies equipped with older firearms. They were disciplined, professional, and prepared for the difficult campaign ahead. A crucial part of the expedition, though not soldiers, were the hundreds of porters. The dense forests and swampy terrain of Ijebuland made it impossible to use wagons or animals for transport. Therefore, everything the army needed, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, and even heavy weapons, had to be carried on the heads of men. These porters were recruited from Lagos, the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone. Their job was incredibly difficult and dangerous, as they were often exposed to enemy fire. But without their strength and endurance, the army could not have advanced a single mile. They were the unsung heroes of the expedition. Finally, the expedition had a small but significant group of allies who joined them for their own reasons. These were fighters from Ibadan, known as the Ibadan Irregulars. The people of Ibadan had long been frustrated by the Ijebu Trade Blockade, which hurt their economy. They saw the British invasion as an opportunity to break the power of their old rivals. These Ibadan warriors joined the British column, providing local knowledge and adding to the invasion's numbers. The presence of Hausa soldiers, Gold Coast troops, and Ibadan fighters alongside British officers showed the complex nature of colonial conquest, where different groups were brought together to achieve the empire's goals. Facing the modern, well-organized British expedition was, the traditional army of the Ijebu Kingdom. The Ijebu people had a long and proud military history. They were known throughout Yoruba land for their courage and their fierce defense of their homeland. So, when the call to arms was sounded by the Awujale, an army of around 8,000 men gathered to defend their kingdom. This force was much larger than the British-led column, but it had significant disadvantages in terms of technology and organization. The Ijebu Army was basically a citizen militia, made up of farmers, traders, and artisans who took up arms to protect their communities. The leadership of the Ijebu forces was in the hands of the Awujale, Tunwashe, and his council of war chiefs, known as the Olori Ogun. One of the most prominent military leaders at the time was Balogun Kuku, a wealthy and influential merchant who was also a skilled warrior. Balogun Kuku and other commanders were responsible for planning the defense of the kingdom. They used their deep knowledge of the local terrain, the thick forests, winding paths, and swampy rivers, to their advantage. Their strategy was not to meet the British in an open field, but to use guerrilla tactics, ambushing the invaders from the cover of the dense vegetation. The primary weapons of the Ijebu soldiers were flintlock rifles, often referred to as Dane guns. These were older, muzzle-loading firearms that were slow to reload and honestly less accurate than the modern rifles used by the British-led troops. While the Ijebu warriors were skilled in using these weapons, they were at a severe technological disadvantage. A soldier with a modern rifle could fire many more shots in the same amount of time as an Ijebu warrior with a flintlock. This difference in firepower would prove to be a decisive factor in the battles to come, a tragic example of courage being overcome by superior technology. Despite their outdated weapons, the spirit of the Ijebu defenders was strong. They were fighting not just for their king or their economy, but for their independence, their culture, and their sacred traditions. They believed their cause was just, and that the gods of their land would protect them. The defense of their kingdom was a sacred duty, and they were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to stop the foreign invaders. Their resistance was a powerful statement of their determination to remain a free people, and their bravery in the face of overwhelming odds earned them the respect of even their enemies. The British expedition did not land directly in the heart of Ijebuland. Instead, they began their campaign from the coast. The troops landed at Epe, a town to the east of Lagos, and then moved along the lagoon to Lekki. At Lekki, they paused to recruit more porters, ensuring their supply lines were secure before they ventured into the hostile and difficult terrain of the Ijebu Kingdom. Once prepared, Colonel Scott gave the order to advance inland. The march was slow and arduous. The soldiers had to cut their way through thick jungle and navigate treacherous swamps, all while on high alert for an enemy ambush. The fighting began almost immediately. On the first day of the advance, the British column encountered resistance from Ijebu warriors who were hiding in the forest. The Ijebu fighters used their knowledge of the land to their advantage, firing on the invaders from concealed positions. However, the British-led troops were disciplined and returned fire with devastating effect. In these initial skirmishes, the British forces captured and burned 4 Ijebu villages. This was a deliberate tactic of colonial warfare, designed to terrorize the local population and break their will to resist. The sight of their homes and farms going up in flames was a brutal introduction to the reality of the invasion. The advance continued, and the resistance grew fiercer. The major turning point in the early stage of the war came at a place called Atumba. Here, the Ijebu army had gathered in large numbers to block the British path. They launched a determined attack, but the British had a secret weapon that the Ijebu had never seen before, the Maxim gun. This was one of the world's first fully automatic machine guns. It could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, creating a terrifying wall of lead. As the Ijebu warriors charged forward with their flintlock rifles, the British deployed the Maxim gun with horrific results. The sound of the Maxim gun echoed through the forest, a relentless chatter of death. The Ijebu forces, who had never faced such rapid and overwhelming firepower, were cut down in waves. Their bravery was no match for the products of the Industrial Revolution. The battle at Atumba was a slaughter. While the British side reported only 12 casualties, the Ijebu suffered immense losses. The Maxim gun had not just won a battle, it had shattered the confidence of the Ijebu Army. The survivors retreated in disarray, shocked and demoralized by the destructive power they had just witnessed. The path to the Ijebu heartland was now open. After the devastating defeat at Atumba, the Ijebu forces fell back to prepare for another stand. Their next line of defense was not just a physical barrier, but a spiritual one, the Yamoyi River. This river was sacred to the Ijebu people. They believed it was protected by a powerful river goddess who would never allow enemies to cross. To strengthen this spiritual defense, the Ijebu leaders performed elaborate rituals along the riverbank. They made sacrifices to the goddess, calling on her to rise up and swallow the invaders. They believed that their faith and the power of their traditions would create an invisible wall that the British could not breach. Alongside these spiritual preparations, the Ijebu also made significant physical fortifications. They knew that faith alone might not be enough to stop an army with Maxim guns. Their warriors worked tirelessly to deepen the riverbed, making it much harder for the soldiers to wade across. They also built stockades and dug trenches along the riverbank, creating defensive positions from which they could fire on the approaching British forces. The combination of spiritual belief and practical military engineering made the Yamoyi River a formidable obstacle. For the Ijebu, this was not just another battle line. It was a sacred boundary protecting the very soul of their kingdom. When the British Expeditionary Force reached the Yamoyi River, they found the Ijebu Army waiting for them. The defenders were well entrenched and determined to hold the line. As the British troops attempted to cross, the Ijebu warriors opened fire from their positions on the opposite bank. The battle for the river was intense. The British faced a hail of bullets from the defenders, who fought with desperate courage to protect their sacred water. The river, which the Ijebu believed would be their salvation, was now turning red with the blood of its defenders and attackers. Despite the fierce resistance and the spiritual power the Ijebu believed was on their side, the British forces had superior technology and tactics. They used their artillery and machine guns to provide covering fire, pinning down the Ijebu defenders in their trenches. Under this barrage, a small group of soldiers managed to struggle across the river and establish a foothold on the other side. Once a bridgehead was secured, more troops poured across, overwhelming the Ijebu defenses. The sacred river had been crossed. The failure to hold the Yamoyi was a crushing blow to the morale of the Ijebu army, as it seemed that not even their gods could stop the relentless advance of the invaders. With the sacred Yamoyi River now behind them, the British forces continued their march towards the Ijebu capital, Ijebu-Ode. The retreating Ijebu army, though demoralized, decided to make one last, desperate stand. They chose to fortify the town of Imagbon, which lay directly on the path of the invaders. This would be the decisive battle of the war. The Ijebu commanders gathered all their remaining strength, positioning their warriors in well-hidden trenches and behind defensive barricades. They knew that this was their final opportunity to stop the British and save their kingdom from conquest. The fate of the Ijebu nation would be decided at Imagbon. The Battle of Imagbon was the fiercest and bloodiest engagement of the entire war. As the British column approached the town, they were met with a storm of gunfire from the concealed Ijebu positions. The Ijebu warriors fought with incredible bravery, determined to protect their homes and their independence. For a time, the British advance was halted. The fighting was intense and at close quarters, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Ijebu soldiers, armed with their slow-loading flintlocks, fought with a courage that impressed even the British officers leading the attack. They refused to give way, holding their ground against a technologically superior foe. However, the technological gap was ultimately too wide to overcome. Colonel Scott ordered his troops to bring their heavy weapons to the front. Once again, the Maxim gun played a crucial and devastating role. Its rapid, continuous fire tore through the Ijebu defenses, inflicting terrible casualties on the brave warriors. Supported by artillery, the British-led soldiers launched a final assault on the Ijebu positions. Despite their valor, the Ijebu army could not withstand the onslaught. Their lines broke, and the battle turned into a rout. The defenders were overwhelmed by the superior firepower of the invaders. The defeat at Imagbon was catastrophic for the Ijebu army. It is estimated that around 900 Ijebu warriors lost their lives in this single battle, a devastating blow to a small kingdom. In contrast, the British forces reported 56 killed and about 30 wounded during the entire campaign. The battle was a complete and total victory for the British. The Ijebu army was effectively destroyed, its spirit broken. With no organized military force left to defend the capital, the road to Ijebu-Ode was now completely open. The final stand had failed, and the independence of the Ijebu Kingdom was lost. Following the crushing defeat at the Battle of Imagbon, the resistance of the Ijebu Kingdom collapsed. There was no army left to defend the capital. A few days later, the victorious British Expeditionary Force marched into Ijebu-Ode without facing any further opposition. Colonel Scott ordered the Union flag, the symbol of the British Empire, to be raised over the city. The Awujale, seeing that his kingdom was defeated and his people were suffering, formally surrendered to the British. The war, which had lasted less than 2 weeks, was over. The independence of the proud Ijebu Kingdom had come to a sudden and violent end. The British victory was followed by acts designed to permanently dismantle the old Ijebu power structure. Colonel Scott ordered his men to destroy the toll gates at Oru, the very symbols of the trade control that had started the war. They also burned traditional shrines and demolished the meeting halls of the powerful Osugbo, or Ogboni society, a secret council of elders that held significant political power. These actions were not random acts of destruction. They were a calculated effort to erase the sources of Ijebu authority and replace them with British colonial rule. Ijebuland was officially annexed and incorporated into what would later become the Southern Nigeria Protectorate. The consequences of the 1892 war were profound and long-lasting. The defeat of the Ijebu, a kingdom that had been seen as one of the most powerful in the region, sent a shockwave across all of Yoruba land. It demonstrated the overwhelming military superiority of the British and signaled that resistance to colonial expansion was likely futile. Other Yoruba states, witnessing the fate of the Ijebu, became more willing to sign treaties with the British, accelerating the pace of colonial takeover. The war effectively marked the beginning of the end of the independence of the Yoruba people and paved the way for the creation of modern Nigeria under British control. Today, the Ibadan-Ijebu War of 1892 is remembered as a pivotal moment in Nigerian history. It was a clash between two worlds, one representing ancient traditions of sovereignty and trade, and the other representing the new global order of industrial colonialism. For the British, it was a successful campaign to secure economic interests, recognized by the awarding of a special medal to the soldiers who participated. For the Ijebu, it was a tragic and heroic defense of their homeland that ended in defeat, but not dishonor. The war forever changed the political and economic landscape of the region, ending one chapter of history and beginning another under the long shadow of colonial rule.